Hello and welcome to Professor Pincushion. I'm Tova and today I'm going to show you how to create and sew on quilt binding. First we'll start with calculations so you can figure out how much fabric you'll need to create your own straight of grain binding. Then we'll cover the steps of creating it and sewing it to your quilt. Creating your own binding is better than store-bought because you have more fabric options to choose from. Let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to figure out is how many strips do we need to cut out in order to have enough binding for the perimeter of the quilt. So you need to know the dimensions of the quilt perimeter, and you can either measure the height and the width, or if you're just doing a standard quilt, you can just use those measurements as well. So for my example, I'm just going to take the measurements of a full-size quilt top, which for me is going to be 78 inches by 87 inches. So 78 by 87. All I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two numbers and I'm going to add them together. So 78 plus 87 equals 165. Then I'm going to take this and I'm going to multiply it by 2 because that's just two sides. So that's the width and that's the height, but remember we have another width and height on the other side of the quilt. So 2 times 165. That means if we went and measured all the way around all four sides of the quilt, I would get 330 inches. Now you need to know what the width of the fabric is that you're cutting your strips from. So I'm just going to take a standard 45-inch width fabric. So 330 inches divided by the 45 inches in width. So we're saying if I cut one strip, I get 45 inches from this 330. So this 330 divided by 45 gives me something like 7.33. So this is saying I need to have 7.33 strips in order to get 330, but I'm not just going to cut a partial strip. I'm just going to round up and make this 8 strips just to make it easy on myself. And it's better to have extra anyways because we're going to be sewing the strips together. So you may be losing a few inches that way. So even if this was 8, an even number, I may still cut out 9 strips and sew them together just to give myself an extra strip for if I make any mistakes or I just need extra wiggle room. Now you need to determine what is the width of your strips. If you're doing something like a cotton batting or it's a really flat batting, normally you only need to cut a strip that's 2.5 inches in width. That's kind of a standard. If you're using a really thick batting, which I really don't recommend for beginners, you might need to do a wider strip, but we're just going to say I'm going to do 2.5 inches because that's kind of normal. So I need 8 strips at 2.5 inches for my 45 inches in fabric, and I'm like, well, how much fabric do I need to get for that? All I have to do is just multiply this together, and that says I need 20 inches of fabric to get 8 strips at 2.5 inches in width. A half yard is about 18 inches, so this is a little bit more than a half yard. So I'm just going to round this up to 5/8 of a yard to give me my binding for a full-size quilt. The next step is to go ahead and cut your strips using your rotary cutter and mat. So I'm going to cut 8 of these strips. It's 2.5 inches in width, and the length is my 45 inches, which is the width of my fabric. Now we're going to start sewing our strips together to create one big long strip. So I have 2 strips here and they're right side up. And if you have a directional fabric like I do, you want to pay attention to make sure that they're going in the same direction and they don't keep changing. So I'm going to take this first strip, lay it this way, take my second strip, and I'm going to place it so it's perpendicular to that strip. And they're right sides together. I like to not put them directly on the ends like this, but maybe give it like a 1/2 inch here and a 1/2 inch up here that is sticking past each strip. And then I'm going to just take my sewing gauge and I'm going to line up corner to corner. And you want to make sure that you're doing it in the same direction I am and you're not accidentally going this direction because it may not come out the same way as mine. And we want to make sure that we get a diagonal seam in the same direction so the strips lay flat. And I'm just using my fabric marker to draw a line so I have some sort of a guide as I'm sewing it. And if you want to just throw in a couple straight pins to hold it, you could take it to your machine and you're going to stitch right on that line. Go ahead and sew on your line using a regular length straight stitch, and don't forget to back stitch either. Go ahead and trim all this off so you're leaving only 1/4 of an inch past your line, and press your seams open. When you pull the strips apart, in order to press your seams open, you should end up with one single line of strip. And this is what it looks like on the right side, so you end up getting a diagonal seam. Now after you trim it, you press it. If you have any of your seam allowance that kind of peeks out like this, you can go ahead and trim it so you end up with a smooth line just like this, and you're going to be sewing all your strips together in the same method. Once you have your full length of your strip, so it's one long strip, lay it wrong side up, and you're going to fold it, so it's wrong side to wrong side, in half, and you're going to press it, and you're going to do this for the full length, so you end up with your binding that looks something like this. As far as my quilt top is concerned, I've prepped it in order to be ready for putting on binding, which means I've created my quilt sandwich. So I have my top, I have my batting, and then I have my backing. And I just did a spray basting to attach all three, and then I always like to do a basting stitch on the edge just to kind of hold this edge together to make it easier for attaching the binding. Now we can go ahead and start attaching our binding. So I have my quilt right side up, and I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to start lining it up with the edge of my quilt. So the raw edge of the binding goes to the raw edge of the quilt, and the folded side goes more towards the inside. And I'm not starting completely at the end of the quilt. Instead, I'm starting sort of in the middle of one side, and I'm not starting at the end of my binding. Instead, I would start about 6 inches down. So this is going to stay loose up here, and I'm going to put my first pin about right here. And you don't need to pin the whole thing because it's going to change as you're sewing it, since we're going to be doing mitered corners. Now I'm doing this to the right side of my quilt because I'm going to end up flipping this to the back and then hand sewing the binding into place on the back. If you want to make sure that you don't have to do hand sewing and instead you want to machine stitch your binding, you're going to do the opposite of what I do. So instead of placing this on the right side, you're going to be placing the binding same way, the exact same thing, but you're going to be placing it on the wrong side like this. So wrong side if you wanted, or back side if you want to just machine stitch the whole thing, or if you want to do some hand sewing so it looks a little bit neater, you're going to place it on the right side. So again, I'm just going to do a couple of pins just to hold it into place in the front, and then I'm just going to keep the rest of my binding loose for now. I put in a few more pins just to hold my binding into place as I'm going down the edge, and then my last pin is going to be 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom of my quilt, and then I'm going to stop here and stop pinning because we're going to have to stitch down to this point before we can continue going this way with our binding. Regardless if you're finishing your binding by hand or by machine, everybody is going to do this portion, which is sewing on the binding on the edge just like we started pinning. And you can see I'm using a walking foot. Makes it a little bit easier when you're dealing with a lot of layers like with your quilt sandwich, so it just feeds everything evenly. So I highly recommend getting one if you don't have one. And I'm actually approaching my corner here. I'm doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm just doing a regular length straight stitch. Once I get to my last straight pin, which is 1/4 inch away from the edge, I'm going to stop with my needle in my fabric. Go ahead and remove that last pin. I'm going to lift my foot. You can see my needle still in here, and I'm just going to rotate the fabric. So now I'm sewing towards the corner. Let me just move this out of the way so you can see there's my corner of my quilt. So I stop, and now I do the pivot towards the corner, and then once I get to that corner, I'm going to do a back stitch, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut my threads. Here's my straight seam, and then it pivots and goes to the corner. But now I need to go in the other direction. So I've taken my quilt out of my sewing machine. The rest of the binding is still attached. I haven't cut any binding or anything like that. I'm just going to grab down here below where my corner is. I'm going to bring it up and then turn it. And you'll see it'll start creating a crease over here. So let me do that again. Come up, turn. I pull my finger in order to make a crease. So this folded edge lines up with the folded edge of my quilt, and then this raw edge is lining up with the raw edge of the binding. And I can go ahead, pin this area. So I'm starting to pin the binding to now this edge, and then I'm going to start sewing again my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you're going to start your 1/4 inch seam allowance at this edge. So I'm starting right here and going ahead and sewing my 1/4 inch seam allowance until I get to my next corner, and then I'm going to repeat this process for all corners. Stop sewing on your binding when you get about a little over 10 inches gap between where you started and where you end. So I'm just leaving this open for now. I'm going to lay this down, and I'm going to lay this on top of it, and we're actually going to trim this. The amount that you want to trim depends on the width of your binding. So the width of my binding before I folded it is 2.5 inches. So I want these two ends to overlap 2.5 inches. So I'm going to hold this point. This is where this one ends. I'm going to measure up 2.5 inches. I'm going to cut it, and then that should give us the proper overlap amount. We're going to sew the two ends together, and we're still going to have that diagonal seam just like we did with the other parts of our binding. And if you're wondering, well, why is it a diagonal seam instead of a straight seam? It just tends to look a lot nicer. That's why you do it. So this part's a little tricky. So I'm going to take the one that I started with, the one on the bottom, and I'm going to lay it like this. Now I'm going to take this one, and you need to make sure that you're not accidentally twisting your pieces. And if you need to scoot your quilt closer, you can do that. And I'm also, you can see I'm opening it up, and I'm going to lay them so they're right side together. So I have this one going this way, and this way is going perpendicular. And this time I'm going to line up so that the edges are lining up together. Okay, so you can see now it's lined up, and I'm going to sew a diagonal seam from this point to this point. So I'm matching up the point that's underneath here, so from that corner to where this corner is here. And I would definitely use your marker to mark it and to pin this, since this is a little hard with your quilt kind and wanting to bunch up. Now, just to test to make sure if you're doing it the right way, I'm going to lay my finger here, imagining it's a seam, and I'm going to fold this back over. And if it looks like you're getting the straight line here or down here, then you're sewing it right. If I was to do it the opposite way, let's say I sew my seam here, it doesn't really lay that flat because this just wants to go down this way instead of going straight across. So let's test that again. So pretend the seam's going this way. I can open it up, and it seems like the binding's going to lay flat. So I'm going to go ahead, mark this, pin it, and then sew my seam just like I did for the other parts of my binding. After I do my seam, I'm going to trim it. So you're leaving about 1/4 inch, just like we did before. And then if we were to lay this back out, you can see it just kind of, this is that same area, just kind of folded back into place. If you want to just try to press your seams open, it'll probably look a little bit neater. But it just lays flat. So this is where I started, this is where I stopped, this is the rest of it. So I'm just going to pin that raw edge and then finish sewing this 1/4 inch seam allowance until I get to the beginning again. Now we're going to talk about the two different ways that you can finish your binding. So there's machine stitching, and then there's hand stitching. So first I'm going to go over the machine stitching part. So with this technique, when you were sewing your binding on, you sewed it to the back side of the quilt. So we're pretending that we're looking at the right side of the quilt, and then we have the back side of the quilt back here. So you're going to take your binding, you're going to pull it out, and you're going to bring it to the right side of the quilt or the front of the quilt. You can go ahead and pin it if you need to, but you just need to make sure that this folded edge is covering your stitches because we don't want to see that. And then you're just going to stitch right along the bottom edge of your binding. Now you want to make sure that you use a matching thread since it is going to show. If you're finishing your binding by hand sewing it, it's just the opposite. So now it's stitched to the right side or the top side of the quilt. You're taking your binding, the folded edge, and you're bringing it over to the back. And again, you want to cover your stitches, so we don't want to see all that. And then you can go ahead and pin it into place. Now the hand sewing does take longer, but it's going to look nicer in the front because you're not going to see any stitches along the edge. I'm just going to quickly show you how to do this by hand. So use a matching thread. I'm just using a contrasting one so it's easier for you to see. I'm just grabbing a little bit of fabric of the quilt, and I'm making sure whenever I grab any stitches, I'm not actually going through to the right side so that you're going to be able to see this. You're only grabbing just a little bit of fabric from the back of the quilt, and I want to try to make sure that I cover this knot so you can't see it. So I grab that. Now I'm going to grab a little bit of the edge of the binding here. Just do small stitches, tend to look a little bit neater than if you do large stitches, and then you're gently going to pull it so that it covers the spot. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of the backing again, being careful not to go through the right side, and you can see I'm getting just past my stitches, so not on top of the stitches but just past them. That way we can make sure that they're being covered. And then grabbing a little bit of the edge of the binding. And that's all you do. And again, it is time consuming, but it will look neater. Let's go over the corners. Now this is going to be the same regardless if you're finishing by the machine or by hand. This is what it currently looks like. So we had stitched here, we folded it, and then we stitched this way. If I was to unfold this, what you end up with is a nice mitered corner. So it kind of has a little slant here. Now I'm going to flip this over so we're looking at the back so I can show you how we finish it. So this is going to get folded over. You're just going to start with one side. I'm going to fold it and I'm going to stitch it. Then I'm going to take this side, and you can just kind of pinch this fold, and I'm going to bring it back down. So I end up with a mitered corner on this side as well. So you just start with one side, just pinch this edge, bring it down, and I have a nice mitered corner on this side and one on this side as well. After you've completely finished sewing your binding into place, you'll have a nicely finished quilt with mitered corners. Hopefully you'll find creating and adding your own quilt binding easier. New tutorials are released weekly, so please subscribe to be notified of the next release. Make sure to check out our other videos and visit ProfessorPincushion.com to view our complete library with well over 200 sewing video tutorials, including our exclusive premium content. Our premium membership is only $5 a month for unlimited access and only available at ProfessorPincushion.com. Also, don't forget to download our mobile app for videos on the go. Thanks for watching.